Hello, all you folks out there in YouTube land. I know this isn't the regular debunk format, as there is no video, but Kagei's been having a long-running argument with someone that finally crossed the line from silly anti-medicine griper to # full Macintosh in a single Google Plus post. In his original claim, which was that cutting down on carbohydrates would extend lifespan, he was asked for a source, to which he responded less than fruitfully. I'm going to skip that, and leave a link to the original thread in the description. I mentioned this individual in the Anti-Vaxx video random rant a few days ago, and while I didn't want to call attention to him directly over it, I wasn't expecting him to go anti-evolution to boot. For context, I will be reading the last few posts in that thread, starting from the first post after Kagei acknowledged that he'd scored points with an academic article on the possible benefits of ginkgo biloba for migraine sufferers. While it didn't do anything for his original claim, it did establish some standing for his argument that not all of the remedies offered as nutritional supplements were dealt under false pretense or ineffective. Not that the point was ever really in contention. The case study was some 50 people, and came to a positive result, although the conclusion was that further study was more than warranted, and one of the authors was working for a pharmaceutical company. As a preliminary study for new pharmaceutical research, it had merit, at least as far as Kagei, Tabita and I could tell. Someone a bit more knowledgeable might have a different take, however, and if so, then please let us know in the comments. Now, on with the show. We begin with Mr. Bill. If an herb has worked for me for 20 years, I don't care if it is endorsed. My late wife had headaches that would put her in bed for weeks at a time. 60 milligrams of ginkgo a day eliminated those headaches. If medical science isn't helping, either suffer or look for alternatives. The existing system isn't going to allow information that conflicts with profit-making. As to not believing in God, I cannot understand how someone can be that ignorant. It is obvious from simple observation that evolution cannot work and that there are too many coincidences concerning the Earth, for our home to be an accident. But I don't have all the answers. You will never have the answers to your questions, because you cannot reason. You require everything to be laid out for you. Science and life don't really work that way. Gidge's reply, sure. Maybe I should have recommended you read a text on the scientific method. I'm not going to answer your Gawd delusion, as it seems you've gotten yourself mired in an intellectual tar pit. I will tell you that a college-level introductory course in biology will do a lot of good. Thank you for the screenshot, Bill, and welcome once again to Dumb Comment Hell. Bill's retort, and the post that prompted the change in video schedule, a college-level biology course from the 1840s maybe. Otherwise it would be full of evolutionary hogwash. Only an extremely ignorant person could believe evolution is anything other than a hoax. There are no examples of speciation. Species breed true to kind. Species that are different, and can produce a sterile offspring. Anyone can say it takes millions of years to happen, so you can't see. It takes an exceptionally gullible person to believe that something that can never be seen is real or even matters. Isn't that the same argument you non-theists use against theists? Believe in what cannot be demonstrated, dear scientist. And now, our reply. I hate to be the one to contradict such a wise and elderly gentleman. I'm afraid you've gone and jumped in with both feet. Evolution isn't some random guess. We've not only seen speciation events in the lab, but they've been noted in the wild with some regularity. Most of the results of documented speciation involve plants, but there are also ring species, in which several groups of similar creatures deriving from a single source population, and moving through B, C, D, E, F, and G, and so forth, each with ranges that overlap in a chain fashion, can interbreed with the links on either side, and far reduced fertility the further you get away from the link you're studying. In the example above, if you are part of link D's population, then you can easily interbreed with your own. C and E's populations are a tad harder, and so forth in both directions. Groups A and H, when their ranges once again overlap, cannot interbreed. Despite the similarities in the two morphologically, genetically they are entirely incompatible. The two are of entirely different species, with the chain leading from one to the other a series of small partial speciation events leading to a complete speciation event. We can most easily observe these things in species that have short generation times, and that's why we use fruit flies in studying genetics and evolution in the lab. Because evolution is defined scientifically as the change in allele frequencies in populations over time. So in a single birth event, you won't see a gorilla give birth to a human child, for example. Both species are great apes. If you could chase your genetic lines back a couple of million generations, you'd be staring at a Precambrian fish. We can use the existing genome to track the current grand matriarch of all living women to just one in Middle Africa 135,000 years ago or so. She is the last common ancestor of all the women alive today, and even that's changed over time. Scientists refer to her as mitochondrial Eve, the male analog, Y chromosome Adam, by reference, lived in northern Africa within a few thousand years after the death of me. There are hypotheses that suggest that they may have been contemporaries, but the geographic separation between them is not in dispute. Just the time frame in which Ica existed. From that point, we can track larger degrees of change in genetics and morphology back to a common ancestor species with chimpanzees, with orangutans and gorillas splitting off even earlier. An earlier creature was thought for gorillas and monkeys, and farther back again we have a break between primates and other mammalians. Humans can be traced back through several now extinct species, and at one point there were as many as 4 distinctly human species that occupied Terra. The earliest fossils we have of complete individuals goes back to Australopithecus and Ardipithecus remidus from 4.4 MYA. That last was an upright walker that existed mostly in the trees, according to her morphology. Almost exactly halfway between what we think of as an ape and what we consider human today. Coincidence? I think not. We have a rather significant fossil record between there and today. Not a few individual bits that would pack a pool table. Right this minute, we'd need a whole bloody pool. Another significant case at that of Tiktaar-like, which was a creature halfway between a land-dwelling amphibian and a fish. When they wanted to go hunting for a link between amphibian and water-dwelling fish, they went to evolution to see what they should be looking for in terms of morphology and time frame. They then found out where rock of that age might be found with the aid of the geologic column, and after a couple of years of looking and even finding other known species of creature from the time period, eventually found an example of the creature they sought. Fossilization is a tricky business, and the conditions through which it occurs are rather exacting, but we have enough individuals of enough different species going backwards to more than validate the theory of evolution. Darwin's version wasn't quite complete, and we've added to it over the more than a century and a half since it was forwarded. Today, modern life sciences simply don't make a lot of sense without it. Genetics, which Darwin was only peripherally aware of at the time of his death, punctuated equilibrium, lateral DNA transfer in microorganisms, and a host of other things have been proposed and accepted as a part of the process, and each explains a bit more about the history of life as we know it. The only thing that we're not at least 99.9% sure of is the origins of life, and that's being undertaken by a science known as abiogenesis, as evolution has nothing to say on the matter of origins, only how things went on after the establishment of self-replicating organic chemistry to the degree that natural selection could take over. As we can have observed self-replicating molecules in the lab, the idea that it could not happen under the right natural conditions, and thus required a god creature to start it, is silly and short-sighted at best. Abiogenesis still has its problems, but it's a fairly good explanation of an entirely workable mechanism. The exact form of that mechanism has yet to be determined, but work continues at this point. Although, I can give you better examples than even the above, and we have a near-perfect historical record of it going back at least 10,000 years. It's something you've seen in your own life, even. It even has its own form of punctuated equilibrium. What a concept. That thing is language, and we have written examples of organized forms going back to before the advent of Judaism, and the Code of Hammurabi, written in Sanskrit. Today, languages are sorted into families and sub-branches that look a lot like cladogram. I wonder why that might be? I'll tell you. Since you've already stopped listening and are too busy paying attention to what I look like and forcing yourself to be disgusted, because languages evolve over time with geographic and cultural isolation from earlier languages. Take French, as an easily defined example. All three major Romance languages are derived directly in their spelling, syntax, and vocabulary from Latin, and yet one must learn Latin in order to speak it even if their home languages are derived from it. If you take an Italian, and put her in a room with a Frenchman and a Spaniard, then you'll get a cacophony of chatter for a few moments, and then silence as each tries to figure out what the others are rabbiting on about. They can't communicate directly, even if the form of the language feels familiar. Add in a Portuguese individual next, and matters are even worse. Although the four languages all have a few words in common, the meanings of those words are not the same except in a very few cases. No, as per the English, the same or similar enough in all four target languages that they would all understand it. The Italian word for silence would do nearly as well. If you then taught all four Latin, they would have a much easier time learning than the poor fools in room B, that all speak Germanic languages, the Dutchman, the German, the Swede, and the Norwegian. You could teach them all any of the home languages of another participant, and they'd eventually get it, but the people in room would have a few hurdles to overcome. English as it has existed in our lifetimes is a combination of Germanic, Romance and Slavic languages, with a bit of its own baseline. Old English is nearly incomprehensible to us now, as first invaders and then imperialism had their influences on it. As native English speakers were ruled by others, they picked up bits of that language as common lexicon, then another and so forth. As they started invading others, they took on words from other cultures that have no direct analogues in the language that was then extant. All of these minor changes have resulted in four distinct varieties of English, and although you could survive in any of the places where each is spoken, you're going to have issues until you take on the idioms of each dialect. They are British, North American, Australian, and Asian. The Asian dialect is derived as all the others from British, and was transplanted to India under the Raj. They continue to speak it there today, although it isn't as common as it once was. That version spread to other areas, but is still mostly restricted to India, Pakistan, and the areas immediately surrounding them. It's not even a primary language in Pakistan, but a curious sort of secondary. If worldwide communications stopped tomorrow, and then came back online a century or three later, none of the languages in question would be comprehensible to one another, in the same way Latin was broken up. The Asian variant would likely die out completely in that time period. It would remain a historical curiosity forever. Just in the last decade or three, we've seen several languages die out completely, and there are yet more than a few that are in danger of going the same way. Changes in structure and word structure due to isolation over time. Sound familiar? It bloody well should. Each person as they grow speaks their home language, but as their population changes, the meanings of words and the nature of a given language gonna do change. Ask a Frenchman to speak to a Canadian in French, or a Spaniard to a Mexican, or a Portuguese to a Brazilian. At some point, you're going to see both people in each pair very angry as they try in vain to keep up with the idiom of the other. Put an American in with an Australian and a Brit, and watch them fall over themselves. Throw an Indian in the mix, and the fur will fly in short order. For that matter, take two English-speaking people from different parts of North America. Better, if you get four, with one pair of them teenagers, and the other over 50. You will get a large variety of meanings for the same word. Gay, to the young and the very old, means two entirely different things. The modern definition of feminism for two people of vastly differing ages is nowhere near the same thing, even if they refer to the same general concept. Small changes that build up over time will result in a large change as time goes on. Those things that society accepts as meaningful will remain, and older, less useful material will die. With the advent of the internet and instantaneous global communications, it is even possible that the majority of common languages across the planet will absorb one another in a huge conglomerated creature that will be nigh impossible to kill. I like to think of it as human standard. It won't happen in your lifetime nor mine. Short of the extinction of humanity as a cohesive species, or the complete collapse of infrastructure, it's a near certainty. There even exists evidence that the European strain of Homo sapiens absorbed our close cousin, the Neanderthal, so even in terms of evolution we have that possibility. Going back to that ring species again, if you collected all the members from one end of the chain, and then bred them back into the next group along, then you could, at least in theory, force the various species to re-merge, although that would take nearly as long to accomplish as the original separation, and at some point you'd still run the risk of a rejection, in which one species from the absorbing group either can or will not mate with them, which would meet with the definition of speciation in your post. There is a species of iguana on a Pacific island. After 20-odd individuals, mainland individuals were released there and left to their own devices for a few decades. In that time, the creatures had changed morphologically, and refused to breed with members of the parent species. For that matter, the isolation required need not even be geographic, although it helps. You need isolation in breeding, which can easily be done if you separate two groups by a significant distance, but even a change in flowering patterns or breeding season can create such an event. Take two of the same variety of tree, and put one in a wetter environment. Eventually, the second group would flower later, and could no longer cross-pollinate with the original group. Or two groups of shrews, one of which lives in a bit of geography in which the weather stays colder longer. Both are shrews, but they won't interbreed, little more than preference and mating season. Darwin's finches were the same thing, and that's where he obtained the initial evidence that started him on the path to on the origin of species. You cite kinds as well, for the biblical non-definition. Until you can define that word clearly and unequivocally, it has no value in the discussion. You can cut that word any way you like, at any taxonomic level you might desire, and that makes the possible definitions so broad-based as to be effectively meaningless. I will give you one thing from your earlier quoted post, however, and only part of that. We never will know how things really happened with 100% certainty. We can, however, create models that describe reality as it is observed, and make predictions of things we have not observed based on those models. Several of those models have stood without fail for centuries, and have since then have been refined and fine-tuned to the point where we can be as certain as is possible that reality is accurately reflected. Some such have had known flaws, and yet still made accurate predictions and explained nearly all of the observations. Newton's laws on gravity, for example. It could not explain an aberration in the orbit of Mercury at perihelion, but it could accurately describe everything else. It remains as a way to introduce concepts to those who study physics prior to the introduction of the incredibly complex calculations involved in general relativity. It also works for most problems that rely on physics, particularly that of calculating orbits and spacecraft trajectories. The only time we need the complexities of general relativity is when we must be precise very close to a large gravity well, like that of Sol, Jupiter, or any other celestial body. Because that, sir, is how science works. You bring up an idea with evidence to support it, and move forward from there, not start with a long discredited book of fairy tales written by Bronze Age camel molesters for their own comfort, emotional security, and self-aggrandizement, and find evidence to fit it. I will not claim that there are no gods, as that would be a positive claim that is impossible to back up. However, I withhold belief until the following evidence is presented with evidence that is not derived from the holy books of any religion. First, you must provide a clear and concise definition for gods. Then, you must prove that such a thing can exist, and by what mechanism this is possible. Third, you must prove that they do exist, as stated. If you want more, for me to proffer belief in yours in particular, you must do all of the above, and these bits too. You must prove that your particular God was ever a going concern, and that he did the things that are claimed. You must then make a clear prediction of what that creature would do in a given circumstance, and then test it by observing the circumstance, and recording the reaction. No ad hoc rationalizations now, clear and unequivocal predictions, and hard data. You can't claim that Hurricane Katrina was a punishment for homosexuality, as that already happened. If you had predicted that specific event before it happened, down to date and time, for a particular act, then it might just fly, presuming that it was repeatable. Anything less is special pleading. Because if relativity, evolution, and atomic theory can do it, why can't your God? To steal a particularly apt phrase here, science, bitches. It fucking works. When it doesn't, it has a bad habit of excising the bits that don't fly, for whatever reason. Be they fraud, error, ignorance deriving from a lack of available evidence, or what have you. In the end, it takes an open mind to seek the answers of the universe. but not one so open that your brain falls out. In your 60+ years of life, you've seen a lot change, and not all of it necessarily for the better. But the technology you rely on today had its roots in the science of the past, and while it is possible that you are correct, it's not very likely. Even if it is, the chances of it working the way your book says it did are virtually zero. It is hypothetically possible that it's all one huge long con, or that there is an underlying mechanism that isn't being observed. It wouldn't be the first time, after all. Tycho Brahe was entirely wrong about cosmology, but it's because the tool he needed to do the job correctly wasn't available until after his death. Even then, he did astounding work given that his only available tool was the human eye. I'm afraid that's it for me today, as it's getting early here, and I'd like to see this video go live before my grandchildren have grandchildren. For those of you still paying attention after this long, don't forget to rate, comment and subscribe. If you want to join us in various social media, there are links below, as well as a Patreon link if you feel like helping us deliver better content. These things take a lot more time than it looks like, after all. One last thing, and I promise I'll go away and get to work on aliens, colonial marines. Thank you, Bill, for volunteering to be the focus of our final niche video for 2014. It's been a wild ride, and we're all looking forward to what the next year will bring. From all of us, to all of you, good night, and may 2015 be your best year ever.